We are reading chapter by chapter this book, Jesus is the Question, by Martin B. Copenhaver. Today, chapter 3, a question about identity. What is your name? Is that a simple question or is it a profound one? Well, it depends on the circumstances and who's asking the question. If you tell a maitre d' at a restaurant that you have a reservation and he asks, "What's your name?" the question could hardly be more straightforward. But when Jesus asks the question, "What is your name?" he asks the possessed man in Mark 5 and Luke 8. It's quite a different matter. After all, to know another's name is the beginning of a relationship. Names are more than labels. We identify with our names. In a sense, we are our names. Shakespeare's Juliet famously asked, "What's in a name?" Then she answered her own question, "That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet." But if Juliet can easily contemplate changing the name of a rose, it's probably because she's not a rose herself. She would not be nearly so casual if the name to be changed were her own. If someone insisted on calling her Julie or Jules, she might well protest. I think of all the ways my own name has been changed, however inadvertently. My father used to collect misspellings and mispronunciations of our family's name. His collection was particularly extensive because for many years he had a radio program. So he would receive letters from people who had heard his name only once. Variations such as Copenhagen, Copenhagen seemed predictable enough. But Copenheimer also was popular. People seemed especially creative with the latter syllables of our name. I suppose, figuring that if they made it into the third syllable, they were home free. That's the only way I can explain Kopenschlitz, which I think was only used once, but has lived on in our family's oral history. We continued to expand my father's collection. In recent years, our family name seems to have gone international, becoming Slavic, Copenhavek, or even Hispanic, Copenhaves. Although the members of my family have had a few laughs over these, I do not know anyone who takes their own name casually. As novelist Frederick Buechner observed, if somebody mispronounces my name in some foolish way, I have the feeling that what's foolish is me. Many people I know have a version of their first name they do not like. A friend, Michael, recoils from Mike. Another friend, named Lillian, visibly winces at the sound of Lily. Then again, I know another Lillian who insists on being called Lily. Many people have called me Marty once. I always correct them. My friends call me Martin. I don't like being rude, but I dislike the name Marty even more. Perhaps my parents inculcated in me a dislike of the name Marty because I was born the same year the movie Marty won the Academy Award for Best Picture. In that film, Ernest Borgnine plays the title role, a homely butcher from Brooklyn. So perhaps my parents were intent on disassociating their new baby from that movie character who was so well known at the time. But there's more to it. Quite simply, Marty is not my name. I do not feel addressed by it. It's someone else's name. We are intimately tied to our names in ways that are powerful and even rather mysterious. Buechner testifies to this ministry. If my name were different, I would be different. Parents who are expecting a child often experience this. In deciding upon a name for their unborn child, they may consider the names within their families or search for a name by perusing a book of baby names. Through that exercise, however, parents can get the sense that they're not so much choosing a name, but seeking to discover the name the child has already. a name not yet known to them. When our first child, Alana, was born, there seemed no way that she could have any other name. She was and is Alana. And to this day, people will say to her, "You just look so much like an Alana." I'm not sure I know what that means exactly, but I know it is true. Alana embodies her name. She is Alana. By contrast, I also know parents who settled comfortably on a name only to change it soon after their child was born because the name did not seem to fit. My wife's given name is Karen, but she says it's never really felt like her name. She doesn't feel addressed by it. The name she feels most addressed by, the name that feels as though it fits her, is the nickname I gave her in college. I was rehearsing for a two-man play when we were first dating, and she helped me learn my lines. I would recite my lines, and she would read the lines of the other character, whose name was Charlie, and it just stuck. I've called her Charlie ever since, and even though no one else calls her Charlie, she says it is the name she feels most addressed by. My father always called my mother Susie, even though her name was Marion, and did so from a very early stage in their relationship. He said she just always looked like a Susie to him. My father was the only one to use the nickname, so after he died, there was no one left to call my mother Susie. After he was gone, she was called Marion, except in her dreams. In her dreams, she told us, she was still called Susie. Not all nicknames stick, of course, and that may be particularly true of nicknames that you try to give yourself. When I was in grade school, my best friend was David Smith, who wanted to be called Smitty. At that time, I longed to be called Kopi, which had been my father's nickname in college. So we made a pact. I would always call him Smitty, he would always call me Kopi. And if either of us used any other name for the other, we would get a punch on the arm. Obviously, whoever came up with the children's rhyme, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me," had never entered into a pact like that. After a time, my arms bruised, we simply agreed to go back to calling each other David and Martin. My fifth grade church school teacher, Mr. Popma, was a distinguished gentleman who wore a pinstriped suit with a crisp handkerchief in his pocket every Sunday. At the beginning of the first class, he peered over his reading glasses and asked us what we each wanted to be called. No one had ever asked me that before. Mr. Popma was not asking the usual question, "What do people call you?" Instead, he was asking what each of us wanted to be called. No one had ever asked me that before. I saw my chance. "Kopi," I said. From that day on, he always called me Kopi, but he is the only one who ever did, leaving me feeling a bit like the character in Dylan Thomas's Under the Milkwood, who was kissed once by the pigsty when she wasn't looking and was never kissed again, although she was looking all the time. Eventually, I simply gave up wanting to be called Kopi. Apparently, it's just not my name. Names distinguish us from others. My grandfather, father, and brother were all named Charles Leonard Copenhaver. But my grandfather was known as Leonard, my father was Charles, and my brother is called Chad. They could share a name, but as with many families, they each were given their own variation of that shared name. Okay, the boxer George Foreman did name all 5 of his sons George, but that is largely considered a quirky curiosity. For the most part, we do not want to share our names. If I meet someone else named Martin, the name tends to stick on my tongue as if there's something not quite right about it, as if this person stole the name or assumed it under false pretenses. We want our names to distinguish us. We put up with name tags, even tacky ones that say and seem to scream, "Hello, my name is," because we recognize that it is hard for any kind of relationship, even a casual one, to develop if you do not know each other's names. If someone does not bother to learn your name, it is an indication that he doesn't really care a fig about other aspects of your life either. This is also why it is painful to have your name forgotten. Buechner, who has obviously given a lot of thought to this naming business, writes, "If somebody forgets my name, I feel it's I who am forgotten." Indeed, if someone does not remember your name, it can make you feel small and insignificant. For the most part, we remember the names of important people or people who are important to us. So it can be particularly painful to have a loved one forget your name, even if there is a medical reason for the loss of memory. It's almost axiomatic that nothing is as musical to the ear as the sound of one's own name. If that's true, it's not from sheer vanity. Rather, we long to be addressed, for words to find us where we live. Each of us wants to be recognized as an individual. We yearn to be known and known by name. The use of one's name symbolizes such ties between people and can actually help create them. So, when Scripture says that God calls each one by name, it comes as a welcome assurance. It implies that God is not an impersonal force. If God knows me by name, it means that God is being, and what is more, a being who seeks to be in relationship with me. It is one of God's ways of reaching out to me. Not just me, of course, but me in all of my particularity, who I really am. That's why when God calls me by name, I'm quite sure God uses the name I feel most addressed by, the name I hear in my dreams. That is, when God calls me by name, I don't think God says Reverend Copenhaver or Marty. Rather, God calls me Martin, because that's not just my name, it is who I am. One of Jesus' parables, commonly called Lazarus and the Rich Man, includes an interesting and telling use of names. Lazarus is a beggar who sits at the gate of the rich man's house, watching his guests arrive in their fancy clothes for the sumptuous feast that the parable says the rich man enjoyed every night. Lazarus does not belong to be invited to the feast, or anything as grand as that, but just wants to get a few scraps of bread that have been tossed on the floor. Jesus begins the parable. There was a certain rich man. The rich man's name is not given, which should tip us off from the beginning that something different is going on here, because rich people's names generally are known, and known well. If you're rich, it seems that everyone knows your name. The names of rich people often are spoken like magic words. Those names have the power to open closed doors. And yet, Jesus gives no name to the rich man in the parable. It is safe to assume that the rich man of the parable does not know the name of the beggar who sits at the gate of his house. But in the parable, as in the eyes of God, of course, the beggar has a name, Lazarus, a name that means God helps. It is a rather poignant name, for clearly no one but God made an effort to help him. It is the only time Jesus ever uses a name in a parable. To the rich man, the beggar is nameless, just a person to be ignored, invisible. But to God, he has a name. He's not known as a beggar. He is Lazarus. Like so many of Jesus' teachings, this parable upends the usual order of things. In the world, Rich men's names are known, and beggars are often treated as nameless. In the parable, as in God's realm, it is the beggar of all people who is addressed by name. Then we come to the dramatic encounter between Jesus and a man with an unclean spirit. Mark says that the man is possessed by demons, but many of the behaviors he describes also could be symptoms of serious mental illness, specifically multiple personality disorder. In either case, the poor fellow clearly is suffering. He lives in a graveyard. He has been ostracized by everyone alive and now lives among the dead. He was put in chains to protect others from his violent outbursts and perhaps to protect himself as well. He is so agitated and strong, however, that he was able to wrench the chains apart. Now he howls like a beast and pounds his own body with stones. When the man sees Jesus from a distance, however, he runs to him and bows down before Jesus. Jesus asks, "What is your name?" This is not a trifling question, and particularly in this instance. It is the question one human being asks another. It is the beginning of relationship. This man has been exiled from his community and has been left for dead. We can only imagine how long it's been since he's been asked his name. Probably he has not been asked for all the time he's been tormented, and that in itself has added to the torment. During his time of distress, he has been known by labels rather than by name. Madman, demoniac, dangerous beast. Jesus asks, "What is your name?" Under these circumstances, the question sounds like nothing less than an invitation to life, the first step in healing. The man replies, "Legion is my name." It is another poignant name. A legion was a unit of the Roman army of 6,000 soldiers. They often brutalized those who lived in occupied lands. So when the man says, "Legion is my name," he's testifying to how many demons occupy his soul and how destructive they can all be. Then, in an odd twist to the story, Jesus commands the demons to leave the man alone and to enter a huge herd of pigs instead. The pigs then madly trot off the edge of a cliff into the sea. The man, now in a new set of clothes and in his right mind, asks if he can follow Jesus on his travels. Jesus has another idea. He tells the man to go to his home so that his friends and family can hear this amazing story and see the transformation for themselves. So the man goes back into his hometown and does just that. He tells the story of the miraculous thing that has happened and about how he has been restored to life. I imagine him beginning his story by saying, with something like wonder, "The first thing Jesus did was ask me, 'What is your name?'" That is the end of chapter 3.